welcome to the American National CattleWomen's podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Leanna Starman, and here with me I have Sarah Tate, who is owner of Wild West Advocacy and is teaching at the University of Wyoming. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on.
So can you start off with kind of your background and how you've gotten to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I am a sixth generation Wyoming ranch kid. So I've been around agriculture my whole life. Most of my immediate family still ranches. And so that's something that the roots run very deep. And I've always cared very deeply about the private property rights of ranchers and making sure that we keep ranches in business so that, we can feed the whole world and also provide our society with so many of the products that come from cattle. And so I went to the University of Wyoming for undergrad, and I got degrees in agriculture, communication, and environment and natural resources. I knew that I wanted to go to law school. Both of my parents are attorneys. They practice agriculture and natural resources law. They have a law firm, Bud Fallon Law Offices, that's based out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. And it's interesting that you can grow up with attorney parents and be able to explain the Endangered Species Act starting at the age of like 12 or something very, very young, and still want to go to law school. So I'd always been very interested in the natural resources, legal issues. I went to law school. I took all of the agriculture and natural resources elective classes that I could and tried to soak in as much information as I could about those subjects. Where my path sort of changed is when I graduated from law school, I was doing research and kind of clerking for my parents' law firm, and we were working on a case that was not going well for us. And I was very passionate about this case and felt like it was the results were injustice. And for some reason that I still don't know exactly why, I took out my phone and I made a TikTok about this case. And so I basically ranted about this case for 3 minutes straight, and I didn't even rewatch the video. I just hit post, and the video went viral overnight. And so then I started having all kinds of people reach out to me about this specific case, which took place in New Mexico, and asking me what they could do to help, and that they couldn't believe that the federal government was treating ranchers and cattle this way. And so we were able to get some pretty good momentum on that case from this TikTok that I did. I started posting updates for this case. And then after that, I had initially thought that the general public didn't care about agriculture issues. They didn't care about laws and policies that impact agriculture. And what I learned from that experience is it's not that they don't care, it's that they don't know that they exist. I mean, I had folks from New Hampshire and New York reaching out to me about, some cattle in New Mexico. And it really was that people needed to know that these issues even exist. So that's really where I started focusing my career, is on the education piece. I firmly believe that there are a lot of laws that very negatively impact agriculture, all of the industries of agriculture, but specifically the cattle industry. And until we can change public perception about ranching and what it does for the environment and what it does for the economy and what it does for society, we are not going to be able to change the laws. And so I've dedicated my social media platforms to educating about agriculture itself. I have videos of me working on our ranch and calving season and all kinds of those things. But then I also dedicate time to be able to explain laws or policies, regulations that are coming down the pipe and that are going to be impacting agriculture, and in turn impacting everybody, because there are people who don't care about agriculture issues, and they should, because anybody who eats at all participates in agriculture. And so everybody should care about what happens to farmers and ranchers. And so that's really a random TikTok kind of spun my career out of control. But I'm pretty thrilled about that. And then the last thing, since you introduced me as a professor at the University of Wyoming, I just started teaching there in the fall. I teach the undergraduate level agriculture law class. It's a lot of fun. And I do an overview of different laws that impact agriculture and how they would be practical to students who primarily want to go back into agriculture fields. I'm sorry, that was a really long background explanation.
It's okay. There's a lot of points with that we take and run with. So since you do so much with social media, and social media is still kind of a newer concept, and but it's a way that us as the 2% can reach the rest of the 98%. But it comes with a lot of difficulties, and it can be done right and it can be done wrong. And so we see people maybe not posting agriculture in the best light, that for someone in agriculture, like, it's cool or, and exciting, but for someone who's not in agriculture, like, it's not putting it in a good light. So what is your advice to people who want to start using social media as a tool, and how to navigate that narrow path to make sure that they're representing agriculture in the best way they can?
I would say, as far as advice goes, I mean, first, anybody who starts to get any kind of a following at all on social media, you just have to be prepared for some negative comments. Everybody's going to get them. For the most part, those people are not worth interacting with. They just aren't. There's going to be those negative people who don't know what they're talking about. Their whole goal is to make everybody mad. And it's really not worth anybody's time to interact with them. I very rarely interact with negative comments on my platforms. I think the more important thing to focus on is choosing what you want to share. Now, obviously, we want to be very forward about our practices, but you also have to look at this from the eyes of somebody who's never been exposed to agriculture. So, for example, on our ranch, we still rope and drag, and we cut to castrate. And that's very normal to us. Those who are in agriculture understand what we do, that it's really not that painful, that, we spray them with iodine, that it's a very normal, safe practice. But to somebody who is not exposed to agriculture at all, and maybe isn't going to take the time to understand what that practice is, it's going to look extremely graphic, and it's going to be very shocking to them. And so I don't have a video of me saying, this is how you castrate a calf. I don't, for people who are interested in those practices, I have found that people will reach out to me in a private message and ask me questions about some of those more intense agriculture practices that, again, is safe and normal, but just not, they're just a little too graphic for the general public. And most of the time, social media would pull down something like that. But I will answer those privately and say, this is why we do it, and this is how we do it. This is why I think this is the best way to do it. But I'm not going to post something that graphic online, because, again, we need to be very open about what we do, but we also need to be cognizant of people with weak constitutions. And we don't want to turn people away from agriculture. The reality of the matter is that the environmentalists and the animal activists, the radical environmentalists and the animal activists, they are decades ahead of agriculture on the education. For those of you who don't see the video, I'm doing finger quotes. It's not real education, but they think that they're educating the public. Those groups are decades ahead of us. And so that means we need to kind of walk before we can run, and we need to really slowly move into the practices that we educate the public about, just because we don't want to scare anybody away. Along that line, one of the things that I talk about, and I had to learn this myself, it's very hard when somebody is being very aggressive towards you or says something like, I buy meat from the grocery store where no animals are harmed. It's so hard to be nice to people like that. Because you hear something like that and it's like, did you go to the third grade? How do you not know that to the animals, the meat that you get from the grocery store also comes from animals? But I think that if you turn around and you respond harshly and you say something like, did you not go to third grade? That person is going to immediately be turned away from you. They're going to say, the agriculture community is mean. They're talking down to me. They made me feel like an idiot. And we can't really afford to lose people like that. And so I think it's much better in turn, if you have somebody who says something like that, to talk to them with like an open heart and say, that's actually incorrect. Can I please teach you? I have a ranch or I have a farm, we raise cattle, whatever. And say, let me please teach you about what we do and how we do it. And being able to approach people who don't have any knowledge on these subjects in a really nice way. Because again, as soon as we are mean to people or make them feel stupid, they're just not even going to listen to anything else anybody in the community has to say. And so I think that's a big thing that I see all the time, that we really need to just stop.
My mom always said, kill them with kindness, and I hated when she would tell me that when kids at school were being mean. But now I'm seeing the application of those words. And if you're not kind to somebody, then you're just going to be dismissed, and everything you have to say is going to be dismissed. So when you're in a person-to-person scenario, like off social media, and you overhear somebody saying something factually incorrect about agriculture, how do you know like when to gauge, like when to step in and say like, hey, didn't mean to eavesdrop? Or like when do you defer, when to intervene and when not to? Then how do you approach
that? That's a really good question. I would say, so I travel all the time for work, and I'm constantly in airports and places like that. And so I actually do this all the time. And I would say if it's just like one passing comment, then I won't worry about it. But if it's between two people and they have several, sentences going back and forth and they're obviously incorrect, I have no shame in saying, oh, excuse me, I couldn't help it over here. Your conversation about blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm a rancher. Can I please tell you about ranching in Wyoming? And so I would say I generally look at the length. I also have a tendency, if it's somebody who is, very obviously like a member of PETA or something like that, those people are, you have to be very, very careful approaching those kinds of people, because chances are there's nothing I can say to sway them in that moment. And so I think that it's also important to acknowledge if the people who are talking are somebody who even can be swayed, or if it's just going to start a fight. If it's just going to start a fight, then it's not worth your time. They're going to be angry. They're probably going to go post about it on some social media platform, and nobody has time for that. And so I would say looking at the length of the conversation and then trying to guess where those people stand, because generally in advocacy, my main audience is the people who are kind of on the fence or maybe slightly on the animal rights activists or radical environmentalist side. Those people who are on the fence or slightly leaning in the opposite direction. Those people who go and say, I get tagged in videos all the time on the internet of some vegans saying that ranchers are murderers and stuff like that, and there is no point. I could put all of my energy into trying to convince those people, and chances are myself alone is not going to be able to do it. And so I typically don't engage with those kinds of people. And those kinds of people are 0.5% of the population anyway. They're the loudest ones, but the vast majority of people are going to be like on the fence. And those are really the people that we're trying to reach. The rational people, anyway, is what I would like to call them.
Yes. People who are open and willing to listen are the only people who are going to listen, for sure. And for everyone who doesn't know, there's actually what we call a Master of Beef Advocacy program. It's completely free online. And I thought about it as you're talking, but if anyone who's listening is interested in getting some tools in their toolbox in order to have those different types of conversations, it's through it's through the checkoff, I believe. But it's completely free online, self-paced course. It's just a few hours long, and it goes through the different history of the beef industry in the U.S. So you have some background in that, and it really goes through how to approach those different conversations and to see it from their point of view, and to get down to the consumer's point of view. So then you're able to talk to them rather than using things like acronyms or talking over their head, like being able to get down to their level. And it's a really beneficial course. I took it and I learned a whole lot on it, and I really enjoyed it for anyone who might be interested.
I think programs like that are great because it truly is a learned skill of being able to talk to people, especially people who have very opposing opinions from yourself. And I truly think that that's a skill that our society is lacking in general, not just agriculture related issues, but really all political or kind of emotional issues. I think our society has lost the ability to talk to people who differ from them. And so it's also really important to be able to determine where in a conversation it is time to say, thank you for the conversation, I'm going to agree to disagree with you. Because sometimes I know that I get into these conversations and then I say, wow, this is going nowhere. And I'm not going to change this person's mind. They are not going to convince me to be a vegan. Therefore, we should probably just wrap it up before, somebody's feelings get hurt or, you cause kind of a scene.
Yes, very much so. So let's go ahead and move on to, we can circle back to the subject if it comes up again, but your other area of expertise, environmental law and agricultural law type of studies. And I know you mostly focus on the Endangered Species Act. So can you kind of like dive into that for anyone who doesn't know, and then how it is unintentionally harming farmers and ranchers compared to like its original intent, and how it's been affecting people?
Absolutely. So the Endangered Species Act is an issue that I said at the beginning, I really have been able to explain the Endangered Species Act since I was 12. It's like a sickness or something that my mom couldn't help but talk about it, and that's who I learned from. But the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. And its main goal is to conserve species that are at risk of extinction. It's one of the very few laws that have ever been passed unanimously by Congress, which is pretty wild, especially when you think about the climate of Congress today. Nothing is ever unanimously passed. So for a law to be unanimously passed, it seems like a very good idea. And one of the things that they did within the Endangered Species Act is first they had different categories for levels of at-risk species. So we had endangered species, which are those that are at risk of becoming extinct somewhere in the foreseeable future. And then you have threatened species, which are those that are at risk of becoming endangered in the foreseeable future. And while they have those two categories of species, they are treated exactly the same. There is no other difference other than the definition. They're still all protected the same. They designate critical habitat the same. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is there really isn't any differentiation between those two categories. When the law was passed, Congress wanted to make sure that the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is primarily the Agency for Land Animals anyway. NOAA Fisheries does oceanic animals, but believe it or not, living in Wyoming, I don't deal with NOAA really ever. But the Fish and Wildlife Service is who is supposed to be managing at-risk species. And Congress wanted them to be held accountable so that when a species was identified as at risk, they actually took steps to get the species listed, do a recovery plan, and get the species conserved. With that, they built in all of these different places that are causes of action for litigation. And so what that means is anytime anybody feels that the Fish and Wildlife Service is not doing their job related to the listing of a species, they can sue the Fish and Wildlife Service. And at a very first glance, that doesn't really sound like a problem, except that the result of that is that the Fish and Wildlife Service is so bogged down in litigation that they can't really do anything with the act at all. They are sued, I would say, probably every single day over endangered species. And so that has forced the Fish and Wildlife Service to shift from focusing on recovery of these species, working with landowners, trying to conserve habitats, making sure they have enough breeding, feeding, sheltering places, to now they're just trying to get species listed as fast as they can so that they can avoid litigation. Because there are extremely litigious groups out there who are, quite frankly, this can be a discussion for another day, but they're like making money off of suing the federal government. And it's very frustrating because they are pretty much single-handedly holding up any conservation efforts for species that are actually at risk. So rather than being able to focus on the conservation and the recovery of these species, they're focusing just on getting them listed. And that has resulted in species just being perpetually listed forever. The Endangered Species Act has been passed for 51 years now, and it is somewhere around 3.02% of the species have ever been recovered. There have been I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's over 1,700 species, plants and animals, that have ever been listed on the endangered species list, and it's somewhere around 105 species have been delisted. A lot of delisting happens because of extinction, or because, well, they say that environmentalists say that the Endangered Species Act is working because less than 1% of the species ever listed have gone extinct. But they do have delistings because they counted the number of species, or there was more habitat than they were expecting, or they found the species somewhere else that they weren't expecting. And so there's a lot of delistings that happen that way. But only 3.02%, or somewhere around there, is how many species have been recovered. And yet last year at the 50-year passage mark, a bunch of radical environmental groups and the Fish and Wildlife Service all got up and they patted themselves on the back and they said, 50 years of passage of the Endangered Species Act, aren't we doing great? It's like, well, I don't know if I would really brag about a 3.02% success rate. It doesn't matter what kind of grade you're getting, 3.02% is always a failing grade. And I think that shows that the Endangered Species Act is ineffective. And so while just looking at the fact that the law just isn't working, if it was working, we would have more species recovered. While the Endangered Species Act is busy, being litigated over and wasting money and not recovering species, it is also very seriously putting farmers and ranchers and other industries at risk. And that is because when a species is listed, critical habitat is designated. And there's nothing anybody can do if critical habitat is listed on their property. It can be designated on either private or public lands. So it doesn't matter where in the country you are, it's all over the place. And when that critical habitat is designated, you are no longer allowed to adversely modify the habitat. So if, say, you have on a cattle ranch and you get a species listed in some of your pasture, and they determine that grazing is an adverse modification, they can just unilaterally kick your cows out of that pasture, and there is nothing you can do about it, and you will not be compensated. And so it's really a twofold problem where it's attacking landowners, the people who are taking the very best care of the environment, by the way, and still not conserving any species at all. Again, that was a really long explanation. I can talk about the Endangered Species Act a lot longer than anybody wants to listen about it. So I'll put a period right there and see if you have questions.
So I'm in environmental law right now, and my professor is very pro the Endangered Species Act, and he's on the mindset of, since so few have actually gone extinct, then it's a successful act, and so he thinks that it's very successful. But one thing that he said that I thought was interesting was that when they are designating critical habitat, he says that the Fish and Wildlife Service is so understaffed, underfunded, that they just draw a giant circle around anywhere and anything that might possibly maybe that animal has gone through. And so do you think if the government, if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had more funding and more personnel to do to go through everything more properly, like would that be helpful?
So I don't think that they need more funding. They're already getting like $1.2 billion a year or something like that. I don't think they need more funding. I think they need less litigation. I think that it is true that they are probably understaffed and they have to focus so much on litigation and the regulations on what is allowed for designating critical habitats and what and listing requirements, delisting requirements, those are all changed in the regulations, which the regulations change every single presidential administration. Okay, so you look at the policies from Obama to Trump to Biden, that's obviously huge policy swings. And so every single time there is a new president and they have to overhaul what they're even doing as far as critical habitat designation, that's going to be time consuming to figure out, number one. Number two, it's going to take more employee power. And number three, they don't really get to focus on that anyway because they're so wrapped up in litigation, and all the regulations get sued over every single time they're published anyway. And so I agree that they're understaffed and they need to refocus. They need to refocus their efforts, but I don't think that they need more funding. I just think they need to be able to use that funding adequately.
So the other thing that he said on this topic that I thought was kind of interesting was that he said that if you have land that has an endangered species on it, don't bother getting a lawyer. It's going to cost too much money and they're not going to do anything because lawyers don't understand regulation. They only understand law. And rather than getting a lawyer, you should hire an environmental scientist to actually survey the land to see if that animal is like actually on there and everything. But at the end of the day, if that extra person you hire says the exact same thing as the government, you're still in the same boat. So what advice do you give to somebody who does have endangered species on their land?
So I think there's a couple of things here. So first, if it is already a listed endangered species and they have already designated critical habitat, there is, as of right now, very little you can do. Unfortunately, courts have decided that endangered species issues take precedence over everything else. There's this case called TVA versus Hill, where they took out a dam, the Tellico Dam that was being built, which is being built solely for flood prevention of houses that already existed. And then there was a snail darter fish, and they took down the dam because they said that it was an adverse modification for the snail darter, and said that was more important than preventing flooding of like people's houses. So it's very, very hard that if the species are already there, the critical habitat already exists, it's very hard to challenge that as of right now. We are very hopeful that that is about to change. There is a case that we are waiting on the decision to come out of the Supreme Court overturning Chevron deference. And Chevron deference is a case that I believe was decided in the 80s, which said that if there is a conflict between a federal agency, and the federal agencies, you know, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, those folks, they're supposedly supposed to be the experts. And again, I'm using finger quotes for those of you who can't see me, the experts in their fields. Supposedly, that's what they're supposed to be. And so the courts decided that if you have one person challenging an agency, you have to defer to the agency in their area of expertise. So when it comes to challenging science, if you hire, you know, a biologist to say, actually, this is not an adverse modification of the habitat, and you try to challenge the Fish and Wildlife Service in court, the judge is always they have to decide with the agency, regardless of what the science says. And so we think that it's very, very likely, based on the current Supreme Court, that Chevron deference will be overturned, which will give you a cause of action to actually challenge federal agencies, even in areas that is, you know, supposedly in their area of expertise. So we work with folks that have hired biologists. And so we believe that in certain cases, we will be able to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service over having faulty science, which it's pretty easy for them to have faulty science when they can't be challenged in court. So we'll actually be able to make those scientific challenges. And I think that that's going to change things quite a bit in the endangered species field, because if you have an endangered species and critical habitat on your property, you will be able to sue and possibly win. Of course, it's not going to be a guaranteed win, but that's going to make hiring an attorney a lot smarter of a move, because you can potentially get listings overturned or recovery plans changed, and things like that that could benefit the landowner. And so we really have fingers crossed that Chevron deference will be overturned, so that for once, the agriculture side will have a cause of action to challenge decisions that are impacting their private property when it comes to endangered species, critical habitat designations.
Do you think that overturning of the Chevron deference would have effects on other environmental laws, like waters of the U.S. and whatnot?
So waters of the U.S. is a pretty different issue. So waters of the U.S. is under the Clean Water Act. I think that it will be able to, because the Clean Water Act does a lot of things. It doesn't just say what, you know, is a water that the federal government has, you know, authority to control and whatnot. But you will be able to challenge, like, the EPA on water pollution issues, or air pollution issues. Yes, it makes it so that you can challenge any agency in their field of expertise. So for the Bureau of Land Management, you'll be able to challenge over land management decisions. You know, technically that's their area of expertise. Like I just stated, you'll be able to challenge the EPA over pollution issues, the Fish and Wildlife Service over, like, biological issues that impact endangered species. It's really going to change all of the federal agencies, because it'll apply to all federal agencies, not even just in the environmental area. It's going to apply to, you know, the SEC, all the alphabet agencies. Everything under the executive branch. So I think that it's going to cause a lot more litigation, but I think it's going to make more of a fair playing field to figure out what is the solution, you know, to the answer. We shouldn't be siding with the government just because they're the government, because, you know, right, obviously the government is never wrong. So we're actually going to be able to figure out real solutions versus just listening to the government because they show up and say, hey, I'm the government and I'm right.
All right. Let's see.
I would be really interested in talking to your professor though. Your pro endangered species professor.
I've tried. I have like sat down with him after class and talked to him about these different issues and stuff. And he kind of doesn't hear what I say, and he just keeps talking about what he was talking about before. But it's the back to the beginning. If they're not really willing to see like your side of the story and what you have to say, then it isn't really worth the time. But yeah, interesting enough, I'm taking that class so I can get my bachelor's in science because it's an environmental class, and therefore it counts as a science. Because none of my animal or plant science classes do. So that's why I'm stuck in there, and it's definitely been an interesting ride so far. But I have been enjoying learning about the law side and the regulation side a lot.
Well, too bad you can't take my agriculture law class at the University of Wyoming. We're too far away from Texas, but I think you would probably enjoy my class quite a bit.
Yeah, I found out the school that I go to have one, but I didn't find that out until I'm like graduating. So
yeah.
But that's pretty much why my brother's a huge part of why my brother's coming to Wyoming. He's very excited to be taking your class.
Aw. Oh, that makes me happy.
Yeah, I think that if anyone does have the opportunity to take a law class, regardless of what kind of field you're going into, I think it would be extremely beneficial because there's a lot of times that you can just get railroaded by these different things, no matter what industry you're in, because the government has their hands in literally everything, and so being able to know all of their lingo and how those laws work, so you're not being railroaded all the time, I think is beneficial. And I think that law is something that everyone should be studying at one point.
I agree, and one of my goals personally in the class that I teach is to teach people when to call an attorney. Because you can call an attorney too soon and then spend tons and tons of money that you didn't need to spend. Or if you call an attorney too late, sometimes there's nothing they can do. And so I spend a lot of time talking about like related to various issues. Here's when you should contact an attorney, and here's when you should contact an attorney who specializes in this specific subject, because my mom is a practicing attorney. Someone could call her for some criminal issue and she is going to say, I cannot help you. Everybody gets the same law degree. They all take the same, essentially the same bar exam. So you could technically practice whatever kind of law you want, but that does not necessarily mean that that's who you should be taking advice from. Just like anything else, you have to find a specialist.
What would you say to people who are kind of like aspiring to be in law? Because we have a need for attorneys, especially like specialized attorneys, kind of now more than ever, since the government has gotten their sticky fingers in so many things. So what advice would you give to someone who's maybe thinking about it or isn't really sure what to do with their career path and kind of like maybe want to be involved in agriculture, but not so much on the production side?
I would say that if anybody is interested in law, I would say go ahead and get the law degree, because you can go to law school with any bachelor's. It does not matter what you get a bachelor's degree in. You just have to have a bachelor's to go to law school. And the reason that I say that is even if you get through law school and you're like, oh, I don't really want to be a practicing attorney, there are still so many jobs that you can get with a law degree. And it's information that I would just about guarantee will be useful to you. And I'm a really good example of that, where I have a law degree. I am not a practicing attorney, but I still use my law degree all the time, every day. It's law school. It teaches you a specific way of thinking. It teaches you really to use logic and reason when making decisions. And so I think that it's a super beneficial degree, even if you think that you maybe don't want to be a practicing attorney. And like I said, I'm proof that you don't have to be a practicing attorney just because you go to law school.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you want to say while you're on here?
I guess I would just say if anybody has questions, if they're aspiring law students or folks who want to get involved in advocacy or have specific questions about, agriculture, law, or policy, feel free to get in contact with me on any of my social media platforms. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, and LinkedIn primarily. I did recently get married, which is why you introduced me as Sarah Tate, which is my new last name. My social media platforms are still under my maiden name, Sarah Fallon. So anybody who has questions, please feel free to send me a message, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything.
Okay, I finally remembered the other question I had that I was sitting on. So with Biden's part of Biden's platform is really diving into protecting natural resources and everything like that, and that's why we've seen him talk about 30 by 30, and I believe he calls it America's Beautiful. Can you dive into a little bit of that, what it's about, and why us in agriculture should be paying attention to it? And
absolutely. 30 by 30 is a very big, and in my opinion, very scary executive order. So to just very, very briefly talk about this, an executive order is an order that the president writes that is only enforceable as to his agencies. It's technically not enforceable against the public. However, the agencies can enforce it through regulations that they write. And so that's important because it's different than a law that Congress passes. So this specific executive order, 30 by 30, which you're right, they then renamed to be called America the Beautiful. The goal is to have 30% of our land and water preserved in its natural state by the year 2030. And what is scary about this is grazing lands don't count. Anything that you're producing energy on doesn't count. The only federal lands that they are including in this are wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers. So all of those vast BLM lands in the West don't count. And so when they started this goal, that meant that the federal government was going to have to add an additional 440 million acres that they already owned, and they already own most of the West. Leanna's from Nevada, and the federal government owns like 90% of the state of Nevada. So they're going to have to add an additional 440 million acres to what they already own, which is an astronomical amount of land. And so either they're going to have to start purchasing land, which based on the funding that they already had, they were going to have to be able to buy all of those acres for like $2.50 an acre, which is obviously not going to happen in any state in our nation. Or they're going to have to start reallocating what is allowed on federal lands in the West. So they have a lot of incentives for private landowners, so folks on the eastern side of the country where there's not as much public land, to either put their land into like very specific conservation easements or conservation programs so that they can kind of fiddle in and make those lands work. Or on public lands, start not allowing certain uses. So under the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, FLPMA, multiple use has to be used on Bureau of Land Management BLM lands. And that includes energy production, mining, grazing, recreation. You're supposed to be able to do all of those things on the land. And up until now, and thankfully still at this point, conservation use, which conservation in this context a lot of times has meant no use at all, which I come from the belief that not using the land is not necessarily what's best for it. I think that human management is very healthy for ecosystems and the environment. But they've been trying to make conservation, AKA non-use, a use, which is doesn't make a lot of sense, but they've been trying to make that possible on federal lands. And I think that folks are worried about increasing food prices. They're worried about where our food is coming from. And the more land you take out of production, the less food there will be. We're going to have to import more food. We're going to have to synthetically manufacture more food, the more land that we take away. And so I think that that's a very dangerous game to be played, because it is nearly impossible to get land back from the federal government. As soon as it is no longer private property and the government owns it, it will never be private property again, most likely. And so it's a very scary initiative that the administration is pushing on, because it's just taking our land out of production and taking away more private property.
Yeah, so coming from Nevada, like you said, the vast majority of it is government owned, 80 to 90%, depending on if you want to count for like bases or not. But then coming down to school here in Texas, the reason I want to mention like the whole issue in general is because when I came down here, nobody knew about it, and it wasn't a thing, because public land isn't as much of an issue down here in Texas as it is back where I come from. And so I think it's important for everyone who, even if they don't have grazing leases or do recreation on BLM, to be aware of, even if they are somewhere that is mostly private property, because it is going to affect everyone. Going back to what you said of, if we take more land out of food production, food security is national security. That's part of not having other countries control us, is because we are able to produce our own food. And back to the environmental point of that, of if you put, I'm a huge plant nerd. I love rangeland science. I love studying plants. This is what I made my master's in. But so I've studied that quite a bit. And one thing for sure, if you're not using land properly and you're just staring at it to make it look pretty, it's not going to be a healthy ecosystem. All ecosystems have a natural fire cycle, and when we graze properly and we log properly, it's our best way to imitate that natural fire cycle. So if we stop imitating the fire cycle, we're going to start having fires, and with those fires, we're going to see huge fires first and foremost, but that land's not going to be able to come back to the state that it was in before, since we have so many invasive plant species that are outdoing and outcompeting all of our native species. And there's so many Native American tribes that would set fires because they knew the importance of them on the land. So the land was never just there to stare at and to look pretty. It was grazed by buffalo, it was grazed by deer and elk, and it was utilized, it was hunted on. And so I think, because when I did go to DC with American National CattleWomen, and they were talking about the new BLM proposed rule that would talk about what had the conservation easements, one thing that everyone kept bringing up is the idea that that's going to bring the land into the state that it was before European settlement. And it sounds great on the surface, but that's not how it's actually going to work in theory, because how the land was prior to European settlement is that it was being burned and it was being grazed and it was being utilized. And so I think if we continue in that direction, we're going to see a lot more negative environmental repercussions.
I would agree. And, to the point of we want to take the land back to what it was before settlements, I vote we start with Washington, D.C. And knock it to the ground and put it back to the way it was. And then we can move to LA, and we can do LA and then Seattle maybe. I get very frustrated when people in big cities have the audacity to tell us who are taking care of these big, vast, beautiful places, and tell us that we're the ones destroying the environment because of our practices. And you look at air quality, you look at water quality. I don't dare drink out of the tap in a big city, but guess what? I drink straight out of the tap on our ranch. It drives me nuts when people from big cities tell me that I'm destroying the environment, when in the reality, what we're doing is significantly closer to what they want to call the natural cycle than what anybody who's living in a big city is doing. I think it's very ignorant for them to accuse agriculture and other natural resources of, destroying the land with our practices. And, anybody who says that, because they are in Texas or whatever, and they have lots of private property, that these issues on public lands doesn't impact them, I would strongly disagree, because right now, it's 30 by 30, but I bet you as soon as they hit that 30% goal, the next thing's going to be 50 by 50. And when they run out of public lands to kick agriculture off, the next place they're going to go is, the big, beautiful, privately held farms and ranches. So I think that's those kinds of policies where they're setting amounts of, acres or an amount of land to control, that kind of thing snowballs. And so just because it's mostly on public lands right now does not mean that it isn't going to eventually hit private property as well. So I think it's important for everybody to watch out for.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you for listening to these first few episodes as we get the ball rolling on these. And we're really excited to see what's to come.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the listeners out there, and thank you, American National CattleWomen, for everything you do for the cattle industry.